right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. There are so many things to talk about today. So, I thought I had something shared. Oh, look. You don't hold anything, it's not up for debate. Is that right? How fun is that? Okay. So there's that. And then I wanted to talk about Riley Nolan. Let's see. And I know there's a lot going on about the Amazon. And, whoa. Uh-oh. I hear myself. Do you guys hear that? Oh, here we go. I can turn it off now. Okay. Twiz, hi. Oh, Twiz. It's fast really late. It was only like 15 minutes. I'm so happy you're here. Welcome. So I know that people are hotly debating the Amazon clicks document. Yeah, everybody thinks he bought a K-bar, but a sheath and a sharpener, but it's not written in the document. That document says they have clicked activity and a witness. That's it. I don't know. What did you read it, Twiz? How do you feel about it? Maybe I can bring it up because that is on the top of my mind right now. Here it is. So, which one was it? Oh, it's there we go. Excluding click activity. Oh, Twiz doesn't care. Either way, he wasn't in Moscow. Oh, I want to talk about that too. You bring up a great point. Caroline, welcome. It's so good to see you. So, Twiz, I was thinking today because, we all know how the PCA was written. It's all word salad. And I do believe this state's response to motion in limine for click activity is also word salad. So then I was thinking, each one of these pieces of evidence that the state wants to present is a stretch. All right, here we are. The car was originally 2011 to 2013, or actually, I might be wrong. The original car they were looking at was the Nissan Sentra. And then they moved on to the 2011 to 2013 Elantra. So it is a stretch for them to go against what they were originally investigating. And the pictures in the motion in limine for the white Hyundai Elantra, you can clearly see that it's not Brian's car. So that's a stretch for me. And also, Twiz, you bring up a great point about the cell phone towers. There are towers, of course, that are in Moscow, and there were towers in Washington, and there's also towers all over the circumference of that area. So there were a lot of people on a lot of different towers that night. So I don't understand what makes it a difference for Brian. Plus, he was actually, even like, I think the picture I saw that you posted on X, great picture. The proposed route that the PCA says is quite different than the route that Brian says it is. And my whole theory this whole time for that has been Brian just wasn't connecting to the towers that Payne was looking at because he was connecting to other towers, which that's what Brian has been saying. He's like, no, I was in Washington where I live. And Twist says there's actually good pics of the white car that Murphy just shared. Oh, does it look like the 2014 or 15 or whatever his is? And then Twiz also says Clarkston, Lewiston towers are what matters. Yeah. Yeah. Did I miss anybody here? All right. And so since the car is a stretch, the stretch to say that somebody who was pinging on a tower is responsible for a quadruple unaliving, I think is a stretch as well, because there were a lot of people who connect to the tower. There were a lot of people driving around that night, so I don't know what makes that a difference. And then we also learned that the police only said that the car didn't have a front license plate because Brian's didn't. That's not actually what is showed in the videos, right? Twist says that he's thinking it's 11 to 13, but hard to tell for sure. Okay. Uh-oh. 1 second. Where's my battery? It's running low. You know? Oh my God, I'm dropping everything. What was that? And so then the way that this clicks Mission Lemonade is written is in the same kind of word salad. And I think it's a stretch to say, oh, well, Brian didn't use his Amazon account, but we do have this one Amazon account that has click activity. But it doesn't actually say it has a receipt, because a receipt, is a document that can be posted to the docket. And I think if the state had a receipt, they would definitely include that, and they would want the public to see that, because that means that he bought a K-bar, and that would be very difficult for him, I think. But the document doesn't say that. Look at Murphy Knows All pics. I don't know which pic from yet. I don't know if I'm subscribed to him. Let's see. Is it a video, or do you know if it's on a post? Hopefully it's on a post. Oh, it's a cute dog. Oh, he does have it. Oh, good thinking, Twiz. Wow. Hi, Preston B. Welcome. All right, so this is what Murphy Knows All has. Let me see if I can. Oh, there we go. So, so it says, upon further review, this is no doubt a Honda Elantra between the years 2011 to 2016. I ruled out 17 to 18 and 19 to 20 due to the front grille configuration, even though the 2011 to 2020 share an identical profile bank of windows and profile roofline. Sharon is running it through the program to see if the profile bank of windows and roofline profile are an exact match. But my educated guess is it will be an exact match. There is no way to differentiate between the 2011 to 2013 versus the 2014 to 2016. The image is not clear enough to determine the rear reflectors. Tony Imel was spot on in his identification of this vehicle, and I was wrong about when this vehicle was captured by the Ridge Road camera. Per this screenshot. All that being said, I stand by my comments in my previous post that it is bollocks for LE to assume all of this vehicular traffic is one vehicle, especially considering the screenshot is the only shot they used for identification purposes. I used the 1330 Linda Lane footage as well, and it corroborates at that AT, or at least AT that at least at that time, a Hyundai Elantra between the years of 2011 to 2022 was making that parking maneuver in front of 1330 camera at 4:05 and 52 seconds a.m. That was the only sighting of it per the 1330 camera, despite what the LE and the prosecution claim. As we now know, the 1112 King Road camera is absolute shite, and at least at night for identification purposes. All right, so then he has this car here. I can clearly see a line here, and this is so dark. This still looks tinted. And does this look like a two-door? No, maybe not. So that's still tinted to me. Okay, here's the front. That is this is as dark as the background. If these windows weren't tinted, we would be able to see a little bit in there. You know, maybe not clear, but we would see the, like, translucent kind of green colors that would pick up and reflect the light that is around. Oh, that's interesting. So, yeah, I think it's still a stretch to say this was Brian's car. And so that's what I mean. So it's a stretch to say that Brian purchased, or like a K-bar. Let me bring that one up. So this is a perfect example of how they stretched it. And Twist says, yes, it looks like it's tinted for sure. And back to what you were saying about the cell phone tower. That isn't proof that anybody's phone that connected to any tower doesn't mean that person is there. So I do think that that's a stretch too. And now they're trying to stretch this click activity. All right, let me see if I can bring that up before we talk about the contact DNA. Did I already bring that up? Yes, I did. Here we go. So it says here, specifically, on April 26, 2023, the state filed for and was granted a search warrant for Brian Koberger's Amazon.com user activity. The search warrant was amended by Magistrate Judge Megan Marshall on May 8, 2023. Is that weird that they did that after his arrest? The search warrant was amended, okay, to correct the error. Amended search warrant dated May 8, 2023. The state attached its exhibit. The search warrant directed law enforcement. Now, see, this to me says this is actions in an investigation. This isn't exactly, I don't think this is what was returned in the search warrant. You see what I mean? This is what the search warrant directed. So when they direct it to an investigation, that means for the purposes of what the search warrant was for, they were going to grab customer click activity pertaining to knives and accessories. Okay, fine. That's what they were looking for. 2, payment methods used. Again, they're looking for that. Details of items and carts to include all items in the cart, all items deleted, wish list or shopping baskets, all suggestions made to the account, all records regarding reviews by other Amazon users, viewed by Brian Koberger, 6, advertising data, 7, devices used to connect to the account, or all links. Okay, so that is what they were looking for. And then the search warrant was limited to these dates: March 20th, 2022, March 30th, 2022, and November 1st through December 6th of 2022. And it was served, okay, on June 27, 2023. Amazon provided law enforcement responsive data for dates requested for each category. The evidence was provided to defendant as the AV003888 on July 12, 2023. On December 18, 2024, the state disclosed the Shane Cox Litigation Regulatory Manager to enforcement. Okay. See, now this is all just protocol they're following. And so then they say the state made this decision solely to assure state was not precluded from calling Mr. Cox as a witness if the court subsequently made the determination that his testimony is based on specialized knowledge. So this sounds like an expert that they want to hire to, here you go, articulate the disclosure, which is the click activity. So this expert's going to get up there and say, based on my experience, based on psychology, you know, when people click this or click that, it usually will indicate these types of traits. And is it likely that this person purchased a knife? And he would say, yeah, it's likely. That to me doesn't really say much, but that's what the state wants to provide. All right, so then let's go down here a little bit where it was saying some other things. What was it down here? Yeah, so it said the state narrowly tailored a search warrant for evidence regarding the crimes of homicide and burglary at 1122 King Road. This included temporal limitations based on the officer's investigations, which limited the search to March 20 to 2022 through March 30th, 2022. It was known, that to me doesn't say that this was documentation. This doesn't say that it was a receipt. So I don't know what this is, but this is not. This is circumstantial, or they would have stated what document they used to support this information. So it was known Brian Koberger purchased a K-bar knife sheath and a sharpener from Amazon.com. Okay, well, where did that information come from? You know, so to me, that doesn't say that it was documented. And November 1st through 2022 through 2026, the right time before and after the homicides. Brian Koberger's entire click history, items not related to knives and accessories, was not relevant. Without any legal basis, the defendant claims that the state cherry-picked purchases out the Amazon click history. This is simply not true. You consider seeking evidence of evidentiary value, clicking this is simply not true. You consider seeking only items of evidentiary value. Cherry picking a relevant click activity on Brian Koberger's account would not provide any relevant context to Koberger's actual click activity. So they're just saying, for example, what would be relevant would be a purchase of a K-bar knife with a sheath before the murders and his click activity indicating a search for a knife with a sheath after the murders. Okay, here's number 2. Let's go down. The defendant argues Amazon's recommendation system influences that users see and click on, but this purported use of AI is not relevant, even though if an algorithm might suggest certain products to a customer, the algorithm would not cause a customer to repeatedly over and over this course of several days browse web pages related to K-bar, sharpeners, and sheaths. Why is the state even commenting on that? No need. If you have a receipt or if you have solid evidence that you do have that he actually purchased it. And then they're going in to say the click activity is relevant. And here, this is where I wanted to go, right here. It says, applying the test for relevancy. That to me doesn't say that's a receipt. That to me says this is something that they use kind of like the likelihood ratio in DNA. They're suggesting what's the probability of this? How is it referenced? It says, first, Kohberger's click activity, which shows the purchase of a K-bar knife sheath before the homicides, makes it more probable than it would without the evidence. And the evidence they're talking to is this. That is not the case. The K-bar knife sheath was found next to one of the victims. So this is a test. This doesn't, to me, this doesn't say that he actually purchased anything. That the K-bar knife sheath found at the crime scene was Brian's. Second, here's the second part of their test. Kohberger's click activity after the homicides makes it more probable than it would without the evidence, but that Kohberger had reason to search for a K-bar knife and the sheaths after the homicides. These facts are of consequence to determine whether Brian has committed the homicides. And as a central question for the jury, this evidence is clearly relevant. The only evidence that's clearly relevant are that the jury will have to determine with the facts of the case. However, applying a test does not mean Brian actually purchased this. So there's one. What was the other thing? It was, and look at this. Here, you think that the document, typically unique, that the document is finished. And then you scroll down a little, and they snuck in this footnote, which I think is very shady. And it says, the defendant touches on the issue of identifying the account user making the Amazon search inquiry shown by the click activity, which means the Amazon account that I think the law enforcement is looking at is not in Brian's name. So they can't come out right and say Brian purchased these things because it's not his account. And I do think that the defense referenced that it might be shared by family members, but where is it where they say this is an account that was used by the household and we have this receipt for X, Y, and Z? That's just not even in here. And it goes on to say, defendant's motion at page 4, the state recognizes that the identity of the user making inquiries is relevant. That's completely relevant. And the state intends to rely not only on click activity, because that's all they have, but they also have other circumstantial evidence to connect the defendant to the original knife purchase. Wait a minute. Which means that's not even a receipt. So what is the circumstantial evidence they're going to provide? Let's see if they tell us. And the state intends to rely on not only click activity, but other circumstances to connect the defendant to the original purchase. So now they have circumstantial stuff, which I guess is it the witness and the click activity, to show a connection to the defendant. A connection to a defendant, that's not a document. The document would be a receipt, and you can submit that to the docket. A connection to the defendant to the original knife purchase and subsequent search inquiries for a replacement knife and sheath. So what is this other circumstantial evidence that you're going to show us that would show these things? See, they hid this right at the bottom, that they need this circumstantial evidence and click activity to show the original knife purchase, subsequent search inquiries for a replacement knife and or sheath. So again, they're saying here they have circumstantial evidence to show he searched for a replacement. That doesn't mean he bought anything. So in order to show that, it will include the defendant's financial activities. That doesn't say purchases on Amazon. They might show bank accounts, but they don't have that in here either. Click activities, Visa, other events. Okay, so the click activity that they just said that they're not going to include the stuff that's irrelevant. They only want the relevant click activity. And now they're saying they want click activities vis-a-vis other events. So actually they do want to use other click activity, such as homicides. Oh, so they're going to use other click activity. So they don't have a receipt for Amazon, but then they want to use his other searches to kind of say, okay, with all of this evidence just flowing in the air, oh, he searched for this, he searched for that, and they want to paint a picture that he could have bought this stuff. A related purchase activity connected only to the defendant. What is a related purchase activity? That's not these things that they're talking about. And testimony from a witness with knowledge that the defendant purchased a K-bar knife. So with this witness, I'm confused. Is that like one of these experts that's going to say, based on my experience and based on psychology, defendants that do purchase these types of things exhibit this type of behavior, and it's likely that, he purchased this. Or was it somebody who was present? To me, this is all word salad, just like the PCA was written. So to me, nothing in there was straightforward. It was all kind of confusing. Even the parts where they were saying, oh yeah, he bought a knife sheath. At one point that it was in parentheses, and it said, for example. If he actually bought the knife sheath and the knife and the sharpener, you don't need an example. You need the receipt. So they're still like theorizing there. And then the other one where they wanted to apply a test. Applying a test to see if these things happened, or applying a test to say these are the investigative actions that we want to take to find these answers, is much different than actually finding and having search returns on that stuff, which is very interesting because it's like the same type of word salad they use for the PCA. Oh, we have some new faces in here. Welcome, Ro. Oh, welcome to IDAHO4. Good to see you. So I just wanted to get that out because I know people are running with that. The state has evidence that he bought the knife sheath, the knife. They said even the original one or even the one after it. It doesn't sound like they have actual proof of either. So they need to find outside information to kind of color a story about, okay, we're going to use his other click activity, which I guess is his search engine stuff, like, Google or whatever search engine he uses. And then they're going to get some psychologists in there that say because he clicked and searched these types of things, it's likely he did this. And then they're going to say, look, these are the actual things that he clicked on, and these are similar items. That to me doesn't say he ordered anything. That just says to me they're going to try to make this fit like they've been trying to make everything else fit. And it's all a stretch. So that is all I wanted to say about that. However, I am very interested to go over okay, we'll start with this one. This is Riley Nolan's affidavit. It says here, I'm over the age of 18 years old and competent to make this affidavit based on my personal knowledge. I am employed as the laboratory manager in the Idaho State Police Forensics Lab in Meridian, Idaho. I have been employed since November 2002 and have served as the Meridian Laboratory Manager since 2014. I am currently qualified and proficiency test as a DNA analyst. Oh, professionally tested as a DNA analyst, and I'm qualified in DNA analysis since May 2005. This is not a consensus in the forensic DNA community that DNA lab analysts should not opine about the transfer, persistence, and recovery, although recommended. Was included in the NIST report titled Forensic DNA Interpretation and Human Factors, Improving Practice Through a Systems Approach, published in May 2024. If you guys haven't seen prior lives, we read almost all of that, and that is a 436-page report. So if you want more information on that, we actually started to read that before Becca Barlow cited it in her motion in limine for the terms touch DNA and contact DNA. So there's a lot of information on that, and that is the latest and greatest in the scientific community. It took 4 years for them to put together, and it's a lot about a systems approach. Well, that says here, a systems approach. And that's how, labs run things, like their standard operating procedures and what they recommend best and what works and what doesn't, and how to keep results current and accurate. And it does take a village to do that. It's more than just looking at the genetic material or the output from some of the softwares that they use. It takes the whole administration of the buildings to make that run. Because if you're off by any means, or if some of your practices are not yielding accurate results, you can have a span of I don't know how long of your results not being accurate, kind of like that Missy Beavers, that DNA analysts who've been reading or cutting corners for how many years was that? So these things are to prevent stuff like that from happening. And when you follow your company's procedure and policies, that cuts down on error rates. And so that was basically what that was about. And it has so many great things in there. And she's admitting here, it's recommended that analysts should not opine about DNA transfer, persistence, prevalence, and recovery. So it's recommended she should not have said what she did. Anyway, let's move on to see how is this her covering her butt? As a result, she said there were 2 members of the working group who dissented from that recommendation. As a result, the recommendation was marked with an asterisk, and a footnote documenting the non-consensus was included in the report. In addition, the report was published as a final draft and was never posted as a working draft to the wider community for public comment. There is a divide in the forensic community on this topic. One side supports NIST's report recommendation. The other side believes that not offering an opinion based on knowledge of molecular biology DNA, when it may aid the trier of fact, is unethical. At most, the American Academy of Forensic Scientists held in Baltimore in February of 2025. There were presentations supporting both sides of the argument, demonstrating the current divide in the community. The phrase touch DNA is widely used in forensic DNA community and was used in Dr. Ruth Ballard's expert witness disclosure for this case when referring to the DNA on the knife sheath. It is typically used to describe DNA collected from items of evidence in the areas on items that would most likely be touched by the user of that item. She can say that, but the direction that the scientific community is going in is that there's going to be less and less of that. There's going to be less and less of lab analysts opining over the how and the when. It's already starting in Australia. It's already starting in Europe. And some of their players that have helped implement that are over here in the United States, in these working groups, helping with training programs for law enforcement, helping with the systems, the standards and procedures to implement that it is not appropriate to opine about the how and the when it comes to trace transfer DNA. That is coming. As she said, there were only 2 other scientists in that NIST report, when that NIST report is like the latest and greatest things, and there were probably a lot more scientists in there that agreed that should not be. And I don't know why they would agree to that, because how and when? Seriously, do we know anybody touched anything when it comes, or touched or walked by? All you have to do is walk by. The DNA is in the air as well, so that's why you only need to walk by, or you don't even need to touch a person for this trace transfer to get on you. And I can show you one of these articles where there was an experiment, and they had an experiment with juice, and these people went and they didn't touch each other. I forget a bit how it totally went, but even though they didn't touch each other, they still had DNA on them from the other participants. And actually, there was more foreign DNA than there was actually DNA in the study. And nobody knows where the foreign DNA came from, because that wasn't even in the study. They weren't people who were present. And nobody knows how that stuff got there, because they weren't participating. Who knows if those people have been in the building? So number 8, the term trace DNA implies amount. The word trace is defined as a very small amount and is used in the scientific literature when describing evidence samples with low amounts of DNA that do not yield a profile or only a partial profile. I would not be willing to use that term, and it would be inappropriate to apply that term to the DNA on the knife sheath, because a trace amount of DNA is not what's detected on the item. 1.1, and referring to it as trace DNA would be misleading to the trier. I certify and declare under penalty. So I'm confused. I thought trace DNA was things that you can't tell, that it was blood, sweat, semen, or saliva. Then that goes over into the trace elements, because when you're getting down to these trace elements, that is damaged DNA. So most likely it was a partial. So I don't know what she's talking about here. So I guess she's saying that the low amounts of DNA that do not yield a profile or only a partial profile. I was under the impression it was a partial profile because of Bicca Barlow. So that's a little confusing, and she is going against the scientific community except for 2 other scientists. All right, let's see who's over here. Rose says, someone said that they took down the 911 call and messages. Isn't that interesting? Why do we think they did that? Typically, Unique says, I went back and looked, but maybe I didn't look at the right doc. I saved it as no biggie, just weird. It is weird. Twist says, we can listen to the audio and make our own. That's true. Very true. Now, I could be wrong about trace DNA, but I thought that it was so small you couldn't tell if it was blood, sweat, semen, or saliva. And it sounds like the DNA sample that they do have, they couldn't tell if it was blood, but they never tested it for that, because I think they knew it was too small and it wouldn't yield results saying it was blood, sweat, semen, or saliva. So, yeah, I don't know. Is it this one? Oh, no. It was, all right. Oh, yeah, this is it. So down here, it says, in her disclosure indicates Ms. Nolan uses the phrase touch DNA only to distinguish that type of DNA with other kinds of DNA. DNA may be presented on an item in the form of biological material, such as blood, sweat, semen, or saliva, or may be left on an item when it is worn wearer DNA or handle DNA touch or transfer, which was in the state's rebuttal. That's what Riley Nolan said. And then she goes on to explain how DNA can be transferred. Yeah, but what DNA is it? And if you can't tell if it's blood, semen, sweat, or saliva, then you would have to give it the name transfer DNA, because you don't know what type of DNA it is. She also says DNA can be deposited or transferred to an item through transfer of bodily fluids to an item. Right. Bodily fluids, which is not blood, sweat, semen, or saliva. It's so small you can't tell. Wearing an item or handling an item, primary or direct transfer refers to DNA transferring directly between individuals or between an individual and an object. Indirect or secondary transfer refers to transfer DNA from one person or an object to another, or object through an intermediary. Okay. She then describes the links of various factors that can affect primary and secondary transfer, including shedder status, which is very good. Depending on how much people shed, they could be the person who maybe touched or walked by an item 2 or 3 people down the line, but their DNA is still on there. And they may not be responsible for any crimes that happen, depending on how much skin they shed. Nolan's explanation of primary and secondary transfer: no reasonable jury would be misled by her use of touch DNA. To me, defendant necessarily made physical contact with the knife sheath. Moreover, Ms. Nolan's use of the phrase touch DNA is not unique, but common with the field. Most tellingly, defendant's own DNA expert plans to use the phrase touch DNA in reference to DNA on the knife sheath. No blood, hair, or DNA from him was found at the crime scene. Evidence except the touch DNA on the knife. Wait, is she quoting something? That's in the defense supplemental response to the request for discovery regarding the witness. Experts in other cases also use the phrase touch DNA in the same way. Discussing the history of touch DNA in other states and the scientific literature is replete to touch DNA. Defendant seems to suggest Ms. Nolan should use the phrase trace DNA instead of touch DNA. However, Ms. Nolan explains in her affidavit she does not use the phrase trace DNA. Now, that is misleading to a jury, in my opinion, because it implies there was only trace amounts of DNA found. Then that's why you call it transfer. Using the term in this case would itself be misleading to the jury because a trace amount of DNA is not what was detected on the item. Ms. Nolan's opinion is, as expert testimony, a witness who qualifies as an expert by knowledge, skill, experience, training, education, and may testify the opinion. Otherwise, a scientific knowledge will help the trier expert to provide testimony subjects of common experiences. As Ms. Nolan's disclosure indicates, she will assist the jury by helping them understand concepts related to DNA that fall outside the common sense or experience of the average juror. Specifically, Ms. Nolan will explain primary and secondary transfer of DNA and factors that may affect primary and secondary transfer of DNA. No average juror would understand those concepts without some type of training and experience Ms. Nolan has. Ms. Nolan will also opine that the amount of DNA found in the sheath and the fact that it came from a single source makes it more likely the DNA arrived on the sheath because of the primary transfer rather than the secondary transfer. That too will assist the jury because a non-expert posing those same facts would have difficulty interpreting their significance. Ms. Nolan's explanations and inference both go to the significance of the defendant's DNA on the sheath, which would be a critical issue at trial, especially considering defense expert proposed testimony that at least implies the jury should attribute little or no significance to the defendant's DNA on the sheath. Defendant argues Ms. Nolan's opinion is inadmissible because she cannot conclusively offer an answer to the question of how and when, and she cannot. But that's often the case with proper expert testimony. That the DNA on the knife sheath is more likely a result of direct transfer from secondary transfer is admissible for the same reasons. The court approved the admission of the pathology's most likely, and we read an article about the most likely and how that is misleading to a jury, because the jury doesn't understand when the expert uses most likely, that doesn't really say much. And it actually has convicted innocent people because the jury trusts the expert. So when the expert isn't clear, when they're like, yes, it's possible, they're never going to say absolutes because they can't. They'll never know. But when they're like, yeah, it's most likely, is that like a maybe? And like these jurors take it as, okay, that means yes. No, not in all cases. That does not mean yes. So like the pathologist Hall explained, his opinion was based on lividity patterns. Ms. Nolan has provided a sufficient factual basis by explaining her opinion is based on the quantity of DNA detected and the fact that the DNA profile obtained a single source. Ms. Nolan's full acknowledgement that she cannot conclusively state how the DNA arrived on the knife sheath does not mean her opinions are excludable, as the defendant claims. It simply means she admitted her limitation, which weighs in favor of the admission. So she's going to get up there and say, because of the amount, I do think it was direct. But then she's also going to be like, well, I don't know. I can't conclusively say that. I can't conclusively say the how and the when, but I think it is the how and the when because of how much DNA was there. No. How can she? And that's the more likely thing, right? Where she's going to say, well, more likely it is direct. But she can't conclusively say that. She's going to say, I'm going to guess it was, because the scientific community, they don't train these lab analysts to know whether it was direct or indirect. They don't train them to know how to determine, or they don't have a process for them to find out the how and the why, or how and the when. So she's going to get up there and mislead the jury with these things. Okay, I still don't know. I still think the DNA sample is so small that it's not blood, sweat, or semen. Because oh wait, it was in here. It's in here somewhere. But it was not serology. Where did I find it? I don't know. We got to move on to the next document, which is, where did I put it? Oh. Oh gosh, I had it up. All right. So which one is it here? Oh, it was the one we're using the touch DNA. Here it is. Space response. Okay. Comes now the state state of Idaho by through the Latah County prosecuting attorney in response to defendant's motion to eliminate regarding the use of the terms touch or contact DNA or opining on the means or mechanism by which DNA came to be present on the knife sheath. The court should deny the defendant's motion because Ms. Nolan's disclosure demonstrates she will not use the term touch DNA in a manner that will mislead the jury. Her opinions as to the DNA found on the knife sheath are admissible under the Idaho rules of evidence, and her opinions are proper rebuttal testimony. Ms. Noah's disclosure demonstrates that she will not use the phrase touch DNA in a manner that will mislead or confuse the jury. Ms. Nolan's use of the phrase touch DNA. Okay, the court may exclude relevant evidence if it is probative value is substantially outweighed by the danger of one or more of the following: unfair prejudice, confusing the issues, misleading the jury, undue delay, wasting time, or needlessly presenting cumulative evidence. And I think it will. And that's why there's this push to not use the term touch DNA and the push to establish those boundaries to say that lab analysts should not be responding to questions asked in court about the how and the when of the DNA transfer. And so, yes, if the scientific community is moving away from this old information that she's using, yes, I do believe that will 100% prejudice the jury, confuse the issues, mislead the jury, and provide undue delay, wasting time. All right, moving on. Nolan's testimony, which will be consistent with her disclosures, will not mislead the jury or confuse the issues. Her disclosure indicates Ms. Nolan uses the phrase touch DNA only to distinguish the type of DNA from other kinds of DNA. DNA may be present on an item in the form of biological materials, such as blood, semen, fresh saliva, or may be left on the item when it is worn, wear, or handle touch transfer. Okay. She goes on to explain how DNA can be transferred to an item, including that it can be transferred from one person to another before being deposited on the item. DNA can be deposited or transferred on an item through transfer of bodily fluids on an item, wearing an item, or handling an item. Primary or direct transfer refers to DNA transferring directly between individuals or between an individual and an object. Indirect or secondary transfer refers to the transfer of DNA from one person or object to another person or object through an intermediary. She then describes at length various factors that can affect primary and secondary transfer, including the shutter status of the individual. Nolan's explanation of primary and secondary transfer: no reasonable jury would be misled by her use of touch DNA to mean the defendant necessarily made physical contact with the knife sheath. And that is completely misleading because nobody knows that. Moreover, Ms. Nolan's use of the phrase touch DNA is not unique but common within the field. Most telling, defendant's own DNA expert plans to use the phrase, am I reading the right one? All right, let's see. I think it's the right one. Most telling, defendant's own DNA experts plan to use touch DNA in reference to the DNA on the knife sheath. No blood or DNA from him was found on any of the crime scene evidence except the touch DNA on the knife sheath. Experts in other cases use the phrase touch DNA, discussing history of touch DNA in other states. Defendant seems to that was a rain. Oh, it's just pouring. I don't know if you can hear it. It's just all of a sudden, just everything went on in the window. However, Ms. Nolan explains in her affidavit she does not use the phrase trace DNA, which it implies there was only a trace amount of DNA. Yeah, she can use transfer because it is transfer, because she can't tell what bodily fluid it is. Using that term in the case itself would be misleading because a trace amount of DNA is not what was detected. I feel like this is not the issue they're talking about. The issue is that you need to talk about it as transfer, not touch. So about the amount of trace, okay, but then don't call it touch. Just call it transfer. I don't know. This is Nolan's opinion as to the likelihood of how the defendant's DNA came to be on the night sheet is testimony. In my opinion, it's not. In my opinion, it's completely biased towards the state, especially if she does use the term touch DNA. It implies that the defendant touched something. But we don't know if he did. We don't know if or when or how. We don't know any of those things. Just because somebody's DNA is found somewhere doesn't mean they committed the crime. I mean, that's written on many of these scholarly journals that we all read together. And we have an article. Tara, thank you. She gave me another one that will explain this. Ms. Nolan's opinion is admissible as an expert testimony, a witness who is qualified. Okay. Ms. Nolan's disclosure indicates she will assist the jury by helping them understand concepts related to DNA that fall outside the common sense. We read that. Ms. Nolan will also opine about the amount of DNA found on the sheath and the fact it came from a single source, make it more likely the DNA arrived on the sheath because it was primary transfer rather than secondary. That too will assist the jury because a non-expert posing the same facts would have difficulty interpreting their significance. I don't think so. We're all here reading the same things, and we're all very clear on what this stuff is. So I think she's sort of just completely confused and prejudiced Brian. This is just unfair. And she's using old information. She's going off old information that the scientific community does not want to use anymore. Ms. Nolan's explanations and inference both go to the significance of the expert's proposed DNA. Okay. Wow, I just saw a big flash. The defendant erroneously asserts Ms. Nolan's opinion is not admissible because there is agreement in the forensic DNA community that experts should not give such opinions. I would think that if your community is like, we don't agree with this, I don't think you should be testifying to it in court, right? The defense assertion is flawed. How is it flawed? We just read a 348-page report. DNA's assertion is legally incorrect because of consensus of scientific community is not the appropriate standard to determine admissibility of an expert opinion. I think that's exactly what it means. What are they talking about? The question under the evidence rule is simply whether the expert knowledge will assist the trier of fact, not whether the information upon the expert opinion is based on commonly agreed upon. That's messed up if that's true. Defendant's claim of universal agreement between the forensic community is also factually correct. How do you know it's factually correct? That's not what the science community said. Science relies most heavily on a report, right, because it's their latest and greatest report. But those sections on even the authors of the report were in agreement. Two of them of the committee members dissented from the recommendation of the DNA analysis should not opine about the possibility or probability of the direct or indirect transfer. It's still going on old information. The scientific community is moving away from that. So there's bound to be some stragglers, but that doesn't they don't represent where the science is actually going. Put differently, there is not even a universal agreement amongst the authors of the work which dependent relies. Further, as Nolan explains in her affidavit, there is even more of a divide between the community than the two dissenters. All right. The state disclosed in its initial report. The state disclosed in its initial expert disclosures, experts from the Idaho State Police Lab who swabbed the knife sheath for DNA, swabbed the defendant for DNA, and compared the DNA in the knife sheath based on the disclosures. Okay. I'm still not reading what it was. Is it blood, sweat, semen, saliva, or is it body fluids? Like you can't tell which it is. At that point, I would think it is too small and it should be considered trace because you don't know what it is. All right, where is that article that Tara gave me? Tara gave me an awesome article today. Let me see if I can find it. Which explains this very well. And for them to be like, well, there's other things out there that say that she's right. That's old stuff. Old stuff. All right. Where do we put it? I think I put it. I can't believe it's raining this high. It hasn't rained or lightning. But I guess we're getting close to April showers, right? All right. Here we go. Indirect transfer. I'm going to blow this up. There we go. Oh, no. Now I can't go over. Oh. Okay. It's not going to let me do that. Okay. Indirect DNA transfer and forensic implications, a literature review. Is this the one? Let me just make sure. She gave me 2 of them today. Let's see. Thank you, Tara. These are awesome. Yeah, this one she gave me earlier. It says, could secondary DNA transfer falsely place someone at a scene of the crime? I would say, yeah. It says the occurrence of secondary DNA transfer has previously established, however, the transfer of DNA through an intermediary has not revisited with more sensitive current technologies implemented to increase the likelihood of obtaining results from low template DNA samples. The study evaluated the increasing sensitivity could lead to deletion of impenetrable secondary DNA. Interpretable secondary trace DNA profiles. After 2 minutes of hand-to-hand contact, participants immediately handled assigned knives, swabbings of the knives with the detectable amounts of DNA. They were amplified with the Identifier Plus amplification kit and injected with their solution. All right. DNA typing results indicated that secondary DNA transfer was detected in 85% of the samples. Of 5 samples, the secondary contributor was either the only contributor or the major contributor identified despite either coming into direct contact with the knife. Oh, despite never coming in contact with the knife. This is it right here. All they did was have people have hand-to-hand contact, and then they handled knives, and then they realized the secondary transfer was there 85% in this one thing. So how do you know which guy was first, which guy was second? Especially if you're not present at a crime and then you're an expert in court, testifying that, oh, I think it was this guy. Well, you weren't there. You don't know who handled it first or second. And that's the nature of the transfer DNA. So that's fine if you're going to talk about the amounts. That's completely different than transfer. And even if you're talking about the amount and you believe the amount puts it in a different category called touch, it's still transfer. And it still doesn't tell you how and when the DNA came to arrive on a movable object from a crime scene. All right. So this is an older article, but I did like the way that they put that first. This one is in 2015. So we can come back and read that one. Oh, I'm not even on the tab, am I? No. So I was reading this one. Could secondary DNA transfer falsely place someone at the crime scene? And in the study evaluated whether after 2 minutes of hand-to-hand contact, participants immediately handled assigned knives and then swabbed the knives, and the detectable amounts of DNA were amplified. But how is a scientist supposed to know what order these people touched the knife in? And which one of the people who had contact with it who actually went to the crime scene? Riley Nolan wouldn't be able to answer that. You know what I mean? Wow, typically Unique says she can hear it. Yeah. All right, so that was a little older. We can go back to that one. And this one, called Indirect DNA Transfer and Forensic Implications, a literature review, is from 2023. And this one says, progress in DNA profiling techniques has made it possible to detect even the minimum amount of DNA at a crime scene. For example, a complete DNA profile can be produced using as little as 100 picograms of DNA, equivalent to only 15 to 20 human cells, leading to new defense strategies. While the evidence of a DNA trace is seldom challenged in court by a defendant's legal team, concerns are often raised about how the DNA was transferred to the location of the crime. This review aims to provide an up-to-date overview of the experimental work carried out, focusing on indirect DNA transfer, analyzing each selected paper, the experimental method and sampling technique, the extraction protocol, and the main results. Science databases were used as search engines, including 49 papers based on the results of this review. One of the factors that influenced secondary transfer is the amount of DNA shed by different individuals. Another factor is the type and duration of contact between individuals or objects. Generally, more intimate or prolonged contact results in more DNA transfer. How do they know that? If the person who touched the item before, were 4 people down the line, is a heavy shutter, but their DNA is the only one remaining on the object used for the crime, how is an expert supposed to know it wasn't the actual person who handled it at the crime scene versus the guy 4 times before? You know, in like the sequence of like how this DNA transfers. Riley Nolan can't answer that. Of DNA shed by, a third factor is the nature of quality of the DNA source. However, there are conditions. Considering that secondary trace depends on multiple factors that interact with each other in unpredictable ways. This should be considered a complex and dynamic phenomenon that can affect forensic investigation in various ways. For example, placing a subject at a crime scene who's never been there. Correct methods and protocols are required to detect and prevent secondary transfer from compromising forensic evidence, as well as the correct interpretation through the Bayesian networks. In context, the definition of well-designed experimental studies combined with the use of new forensic techniques could improve our knowledge in this challenging field, reinforcing the value of DNA evidence in criminal trials. Introduction. In forensic investigations, sampling methods play a crucial role in obtaining DNA evidence. The careful collection of samples from crime scenes, victims, and suspects ensures the accuracy and reliability of DNA analysis. At the same time, the extraction, quantification, and amplification of DNA from these samples further enhance the investigative process. All of these processes are vital as they enable forensic scientists to analyze and compare DNA samples, aiding in the identification of individuals linking substance to the crime and providing valuable evidence in court proceedings. In recent years, DNA profiling techniques have been developed into highly sensitive tools. To date, it is possible to obtain a complete profile using small quantities of DNA recovered at a crime scene. For example, a complete DNA profile can be produced using as little as 100 picograms of DNA, equivalent to about 15-20 human skin cells. In this context, on the one hand, several cold cases have been solved. However, on the other hand, it is possible to obtain a profile of a subject who was never physically at the scene. For these reasons, while defense attorneys rarely challenge the presence of DNA trace evidence sub-source level in court, they increasingly question the mechanisms of DNA transfer to the crime scene, which is activity level. The activity level of the DNA transfer in criminal cases is of great importance, as it has been observed that not only direct transfer of DNA, primary, can be found at a crime scene, but also indirect transfer, which is secondary, from unrelated individuals through potential vectors such as objects or persons. Numerous studies have described this possibility, highlighting the crucial role that DNA transfer can play in criminal investigations. A seminal paper on the possibility of indirect DNA transfer was written by Dan Orshaw, the godfather of the DNA world, and Jones in 1997. 15 years later, in another research paper on this theme, reinforced the theory of Ladd et al. Describing the secondary transfer of DNA in two possible ways: from skin to object, from the skin to object to skin. The Locard's exchange principle, which could be summarized with the sentence, "Every contact leaves a trace." During a crime scene investigation, trace DNA may be collected and handled from a suspected handled surface/object. Based on recent review, the DNA transferred exogenous nucleated cells, endogenous nucleated cells, or enucleated cornicinites. The ability to release touch DNA may be subject related. The first part of the research evaluated the ability to shed trace DNA, and forensic researchers concluded that a subject could be classified as a good shedder or poor bad shedder. Further studies clarified that a shedder status not two, but three categories of status should be used: high, intermediate, and low shedder. In this scenario, numerous scientific works have investigated the phenomenon of quote-unquote touch DNA. However, the possibility of generating a secondary transfer still remains challenging scientific question that needs further investigation. For this reason, this review aims to provide an up-to-date overview of experimental work carried out focusing on secondary transfer DNA, analyzing for each selected paper the experimental method, the sampling technique, the extraction protocols, and the main results. A critical overview of secondary transfer may be useful in order to define future research lines, filling the gaps in our knowledge in this challenging field. So they used a systematic review was conducted according to the PRISMA guidelines. Okay. The following words are used, which we know there's touch, secondary, indirect, direct. Okay. Let's move down here a little bit. Here are the results. Wait a minute. No. Okay, so as summarized in Figure 2A, based on the author's affiliation, the research groups that contributed to these selected articles came from Australia, United States, Germany, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, Norway, Italy, Austria, Israel, Spain, analyzing the distribution of articles by year publication. The paper on indirect DNA transfer that included sufficient methods, details, and published in 1999, while many studies were performed in the last 7 years. So the United States is working with all of these other countries. And a lot of these other countries, all of them are actually limiting the court's use of the word touch, and they're limiting the trace and transfer DNA altogether because scientists cannot answer the question of how and the why. So if the United States is working with these other countries where they are going in that direction, and we're starting to very slowly, that still means Riley Nolan is just wrong for using old information and still going with it. All right, so for LAD, their experimental model was the researchers examined two forms of secondary transfer, which included skin-to-skin contact through handshaking and skin-to-object to skin contact. Secondary transfer was not observed in this experimental method. The first scenario, participants categorized as good, poor, and we're asked to hold hands for a minute. Oh, we're going to the next one. The following is for the poor shutters. Okay. The main findings were secondary transfer occurred when the DNA from the hand of the good shutter was transferred to an object through the poor shutter. The authors concluded that the secondary transfer under optimized conditions, it is possible and may result in a single full profile. But which one was it? Was it the first person who touched it or the second person, or is it a combination of the two? All right, in the second scenario, there was a 30-minute delay between the human contact and the poor shutters gripping the tube during the experiment. And this says in both, so in both of these, so there was a 30-minute delay in that one, and in the third scenario, there was a 1 hour gap between human contact and the tube gripping for the poor shutters in the experiment. And so in both of these, it resulted in both the second and third scenarios, it was observed that the first shutter pairing led to secondary transfer. The recovered DNA profiles were mixed and included between 80 and 100% of the good shutter's profile in every instance of the secondary transfer. So how is a lab analyst supposed to answer that question if they don't know the identity of the secondary transfer, who's a good shutter, poor shutter, intermediate shutter, and their skin cells remain on the object even though their identity is unknown and you don't know who they are? So you're arresting somebody else for a crime they didn't commit. I don't know. Next one. In this experiment, modeled 3 biological materials, pure DNA, blood, and saliva were tested, evaluating the transfer between the two different substrates. Plastic, hard, non-porous, and cotton and wool, soft porous. Wet samples were handled, depositing biological fluid onto the primary substrate and then applying the secondary substrate within the time frame of 10 to 60 seconds. In the case of the dry samples, the biological fluid was deposited onto primary substrate and allowed to dry for 18 to 24 hours at room temperature before the secondary substrate was applied. Contact was established through these 3 modes: passive, pressure, and friction. In this experimental model, it was found that the secondary transfer is significantly influenced by the moisture content. In the case of wet substrate, the substrate type and manner of contact, which was passive and pressure contact, although the experiment involved testing 3 distinct biological sources: pure DNA, saliva, and blood. There were no significant differences detected in the secondary transfer rates. Okay. Next one, the experiment involved creating a primary deposit of touch DNA by rubbing the skin over the designated area for 10 to 15 seconds. The researchers then evaluated the effects of the different moisture levels, fresh and dry, primary and secondary substrates of soft porous cotton and hard porous plastic, and modes of contact were passive, pressure, and friction. According to the experiment, the type of substrate used for the primary transfer plays a critical role in secondary transfer evaluation. If the skin cells are deposited on cotton, the retrieved amount is approximately 20 times greater when deposited on plastic. The secondary transfer of skin cells was found to occur more easily when the primary substrate was non-porous than porous. Contact through friction was also observed, significantly increased the rate of transfer. I would like to know, with their passive pressure and friction, and how they concluded that these techniques influence the amount of DNA. How does that differ from looking at people who are good shedders, intermediate shedders, or poor shedders? Can you tell the difference between a heavy shedder and somebody who put pressure on something, you know? Next one is to conduct the experiment, saliva or venous blood from male donors placed on paper, cotton, cloth, and plastic surfaces covering an area of 2.2 the equal moisture. The stains were left to dry overnight and then subjected to different scenarios. The first scenario involved pressing the thumb on the stain for 2 seconds, while the scenario involving the rubbing of the surface of paper or the thumb for 10 seconds before swabbing a contact area to assess secondary transfer. So that resulted in the transfer of saliva stains through rubbing and pressing onto paper only yielded 50% of the detectable stains with very low levels of DNA ranging from 0 to 1 picograms. On the other hand, the secondary transfer of blood stains resulted in relevant values. However, it was found that only a few instances of DNA concentrations were sufficient for complete DNA profiles, and these instances were transferred from stains on plastic. All right. Oh, here we go to the United States one. Oh, I forgot. Okay, so the first one we read was the United States. The second one was United Kingdom. Australia was number 3. Australia was number 4, Germany was number 5, and now we're on number 6, which is the United States again. So United States. First scenario, thumbs were licked. Oh, God, I gotta go to the licking? They're the only ones who went to the licking. They were licked. What? And subjects grasped sterile plastic conical tubes after each drying time. All right, so all these scenarios led to one result. So I'm going to read down these scenarios. Second scenario, saliva was deposited on pens. Subsequently, subjects were required to pass the pens to their designated partner after each drying time. Pens were gripped in the same way as the tubes. The partner's palms were then swabbed. Third scenario, thumbs covered by gloves were licked. As subjects grasped sterile plastic conical tubes after each drying time, tubes were then swabbed. In the fourth scenario of the study, pens were contaminated with saliva and then passed between subjects after different drying times. The pens were held like tubes and the subjects' palms were moistened before they grasped them. The pens were swabbed for DNA analysis. The fifth scenario of this study, the subjects moistened their thumbs after each drying time by licking them. Oh, there's some more licking here. Followed that, they grasped sterilized plastic conical tubes, which were then swabbed to collect any DNA. So all this licking, all of it resulted in this. According to this study, when DNA is transferred from saliva, the genetic material of the original contributor can make up most of the resulting mixture. The amount of moisture present during the transfer, along with the texture and surface, along with the objects involved, are important factors that affect the transfer. It is important to consider these factors when analyzing DNA transfers. Okay, so that was saliva. But when we're talking about Brian Kohlberger, I think it was his skin cells, right? Because it wasn't blood, sweat, semen, or saliva. That was depositing blood. All right, I have to get ready to get onto CJ's show. I did put CJ's link in the description for anybody who wants to follow me over. Oh, CJ, you're in here. Oh, you sent a DM. Oh, I didn't see you. How long ago was that? That was like 20 minutes ago. All right, let's see. Technical issues. I thought we were going on at 8. Let me see. Here we go. To 9 p.m. That's fine. Okay. Oh, I hope you find a cable, CJ. Cable. Okay. So if he's gonna go on at 9 EST, yeah, that means we can talk a little longer, and then I'll go over. All right. So 9 is perfect. Oh, I'm gonna say good luck, CJ. Oh. Okay, he's gonna go get a cable because he's having technical issues, and then he wants to go on at 9. So that'll all be good. Thank you, CJ. I'm sorry, I was over there reading. Aw, welcome, Mommy Ball. Mommy Ball says, "Hi everyone, loving these breakdowns." Awesome, thank you. All right, now we can go back to the we were right under the United States one. Yeah, because United States did all the licking. Even though that's not traced, we can still get a pretty good idea of how it worked. All right, next, we're going to Australia again. This study involved depositing blood onto substrate in 15 ULs amounts and transferring touch DNA. This is good because, will it be able to tell us if they can see touch DNA in blood? Whoa. I hear thunder too. It's weird. It's the first one, I think. Second one. Second one this season for these rains. Transferring DNA through various methods, such as rubbing hands over cotton or repeatedly placing hands on the glass. Wet blood was immediately transferred, while dry blood was allowed to dry completely. Touch DNA was deposited on the primary substrate and then transferred onto the subsequent substrates within an hour. The primary substrate with DNA was flipped over and placed on top of the secondary substrate for deposition. So this experiment resulted in, according to this study, the transfer DNA from saliva is influenced by the substrate and the biological source type. The researchers confirmed the evidence of secondary and subsequent DNA transfer in their experimental model. They found that the DNA transferred more readily to and from glass than it did to and from cotton. Additionally, the transfer of touch DNA was found to be less significant than wet or dry blood on either cotton or glass. Notably, the study found that wet blood transferred more effectively than dry blood on both cotton and glass surfaces. Okay, next we're going to Italy. Italy, their experiment model. 3 different scenarios were evaluated. First scenario, before hand washing, 8 subjects. Oh, we're getting hand washing. This does play a role too. And as we know, Brad Koberger might have obsessive compulsive disorder, and he might wash his hands 1 million times a day. So that also impacts transfer. Hello, Tanal. Welcome. Tanal says, science that is being used to convict people should be regulated. Absolutely. And that is another reason why Riley Nolan should not get up on the stand and talk about quote-unquote touch DNA and her guesses for direct or indirect transfer. All right, where were we? So yeah, we're getting into hand washing, which definitely contributes. So 8 subjects were asked to rub a fingertip on a typical subcutaneous skin area of another individual. For example, back of the hand and back of the forearm. Subsequently, they pressed on a glass slide. Second scenario, the same deposition was provided 10 minutes after conventional hand washing. Third scenario, the same deposition was provided 10 minutes after hand washing with antiseptic soak and air drying. So antiseptic soak, I do believe, kills germs, and germs are very similar to trace touch DNA. So antimicrobial things are like brass. Antimicrobial mimics that chemical reaction that happens with brass that kills or damages the DNA. So that's interesting that they did that with antiseptic soap too. All right, so these 3 different experiments, these were the main findings. In evaluating genetic results, it is important to consider the specific previous touched cutaneous area, whether it is subcutaneous or non-cutaneous skin areas, as DNA secondary transfer is a significant phenomenon. Okay. I don't know if they had any results. All right, Norway. We're going to Norway next. Okay. Oh, we were in Norway. We're going to be in Norway for 2 more times. Okay. In this study, each participant's computer, keyboard, and mouse were exchanged with those of another participant. And the new user used the equipment for an entire duration of the study. Okay. So the major findings, according to findings of this study, it is feasible for DNA of the first user to be transferred into the hands of a new user, even 8 days after the latter has touched the computer equipment. Isn't that interesting? So Riley Nolan is going to get up there. She's going to be able to tell you who the people that play out in the scenario, secondary transfer, tertiary transfer, who are these people? And especially if the type of DNA is indicative of transfer. Okay, next, we're going to Norway again. The first substrate, either a piece of wood or a plastic tube, was picked up by donors and held for 30 seconds with moderate pressure and friction. After this, the substrate was placed on a clean bench paper. The investigator, quote-unquote investigator, who wore personnel protective equipment, then picked up the same substrate and held it in either right hand glove for 30 seconds. Finally, the substrate was placed back onto the bench paper and the right hand glove was held against new pre-cleaned items with moderate pressure and friction. Okay, main findings. Based on the results of this study, DNA was readily transferred to wood and plastic, while less was transferred to a metal door handle, demonstrating that secondary and tertiary transfer is a possible event. Right, but if it's secondary or tertiary, who's the first and second and third people in the scenario. So how can you say, well, we identified this one, so we know this is the one, when there could be other things on there? Or even if you do only find one single source, still, how do you know? How do you know that that's the last person who touched it? Or if that guy was 3 or 4, before this? Riley Nolan cannot answer that question. She just can't. Nobody can. All right, we'll go to Australia. Oh, this is by Orshat. Here we go. Let's see what Orshat did. During a 20-minute social interaction, 3 individuals were invited to participate in a blind experiment where they had a drink of juice and chatted while being video recorded. The experiment involved collecting samples from various segments such as the table, chair arms, top only, jug handle, remaining surface of the jug, entire outer surface of the glasses, and left and right hands of each participant. Main findings. DNA that can be measured was discovered on numerous surfaces and objects during testing. The lowest number of contributors necessary to account for the findings was recorded for each test surface. In addition, some of the test surfaces and objects exhibited unidentified DNA profiles. Right. People who weren't involved in the study, their DNAs hadn't ended up on there. But how do you know what order they touched the things? Like, yeah, you have the list of the participants. But as you can see, Riley Nolan doesn't have the list of participants who may have touched the sheath or walked by the sheath or however the DNA was transferred. She didn't have all the names of the people of the history of that movable object. So we're going to Germany next. The authors washed 2 pieces of clothing, one with skin cells and the other with blood, either using a washing machine or hand washing techniques. Main findings. According to the findings of the research, blood cells were consistently observed to transfer from one object to another. Combining buccal swabs and clothes for washing did not yield complete STR profiles. Lastly, the transmission of enough epithelial skin cells from one fabric to another during washing for a reliable STR analysis, for example, a full profile, is highly unlikely. Okay. United States. The goal of this study was to investigate the collection and profiling of DNA from both fired and unfired ammunition, which are frequently discovered during searches of individuals to simulate various context scenarios. DNA testing was conducted on casings and cartridges. Main findings. According to the findings of the current research, a combined profile was typically detected. However, in approximately 97% of the cases, the individuals operating the weapons and ammunition loader was identified as the source of the profile. Switzerland. Various items such as computer mouse, pen, bracelet, necklace, key, watch, nurse cap, and nitrile gloves were chosen for the study. The first participant used the gloves frequently over a span of 8 to 10 days, while the second subject was asked to handle the same item for 3 separate simulation sessions of 5, 30, and 120 minutes each. Main findings. According to this study, the percentage contribution of the second user's DNA profile increased significantly from 21% to 73% of the total DNA profile after 5 and 120 minutes, respectively, compared to the object's owner on all objects examined. So even though the DNA profiles did increase significantly from 21 to 73, I'm still curious about how they know. Well, they know who's primary and secondary transfer. They know those identities because this is a controlled experiment. All right, Australia. This study examined various situations to determine the extent and frequency of DNA transfer between simulated crime scene materials such as cotton or glass and high-risk vectors like scissors, forceps, and gloves. Findings. According to this study, it was found that DNA containing material could be transferred between exhibits through the use of scissors, forceps, and gloves. Touch DNA transfer observed to be the highest when non-porous glass was used as primary substrate, followed by porous cotton and the secondary substrate. These results demonstrate the potential for DNA transfer between different materials and objects and suggested that the source of the DNA profile may be identifiable even after transfer. All right, Australia again. In experiment 1, dried blood or touch DNA was transferred from a primary substrate made of cotton or glass to secondary substrate of DNA-free cotton or glass using scissors, forceps, or gloves. Like, is that supposed to simulate, what crime techs would use? Like, DNA could transfer while they're handling items to test for DNA as well. The researchers applied both heavy multiple and light singular contact in pairwise combinations. This implies that DNA can be transferred between exhibits through these common tools and that the source of the DNA profile may be identifiable even after transfer. Okay, main findings. The authors concluded that a significant amount of DNA persisted on scissors, forceps, and gloves even after the transfer of dried blood from a primary cotton substrate to a DNA-free secondary cotton substrate. The nature of the contact did not impact the retention of dried blood on vectors. However, the transfer of touch DNA from and to cotton resulted in fewer alleles remaining on these vectors. All right. Oh, Australia again. Hold on. Through these common tools, where did I go? Different sources were investigated. Touch, negative touch, negative saliva touch, and negative saliva touch. Hold on. I don't know what that means. Oh, maybe that means the scenarios of touch versus touch, saliva versus touch, and then touch versus saliva. Okay. This study demonstrated that there is no clear preference for the sampling method, and the biological source is very important in order to determine the second transfer event. I don't think I understand that. A biological source, which would be either the touch or the saliva. Okay. All right. So, all right, next stop, we're going to the United States. The participants in this study wore gloves for 1.5 hours before collecting samples to limit the presence of foreign DNA on their hands. Wearing gloves was also expected to promote the transfer of DNA by increasing the amount of sweat and oils on the participants' hands. Once they removed the gloves, the participants shook hands vigorously for 2 minutes to simulate intimate contact, and then immediately handled their assigned knives for 2 minutes. The authors of this study, findings. The authors of this study were able to show that secondary DNA transfer, which refers to DNA belonging to an individual who did not directly touch the knife, was possible. Out of 20 instances, 16 were found to have alleles that could be attributed to this type of transfer. That is a lot. Out of 20 times or 20 instances, there were 16 that it happened to. Hi, Twiz, welcome back. Tanel asks, was the snap swabbed and tested? We don't know. We do know that it wasn't tested for biological material because they were saving it for a thumbprint or a fingerprint of sorts, the fingerprinting process. After that, we're not sure. It was never a swab for biological material. It was just safe for fingerprinting, but we don't know if they fingerprinted it. Great question. All right, where do we leave off? All right, United Kingdom. All right, they have 2 scenarios, and each scenario had their different findings. All right, so the first scenario, the male participant made physical contact with a female participant's face for 2 minutes. Following, held hands and massaged them together for 3 minutes. The male participant then proceeded to simulate urination by removing his penis from his underwear over the waistband and holding it with both hands for 30 seconds to increase the chances of DNA transfer. Both hands were used to hold the penis before returning to the underwear. Afterwards, the male volunteer removed his underwear while wearing gloves and swabbed the shaft of his penis. So this resulted in, on the underwear samples, DNA matching the female participant was detected. However, none of the penile samples taken 6 hours after the staged non-intimate social contact event showed any matching female DNA. In the second scenario, the male participant collected penile swabs after engaging in unprotected sexual intercourse with the female. The researchers collected the underwear that the participant wore immediately after the intercourse and recovered samples from it. Main findings: the female participant's DNA profile was found to match on all waistband samples, inside front samples, and on samples collected from the inside back, outside front, and outside back areas of the clothing. These findings suggest a possibility of DNA transfer through physical contact with a female participant. Okay, next we're going to Switzerland. Switzerland, the initial participant was instructed to interact with 9 objects made of plastic, metal, nitrile, and fabric, which are typically present at crime scenes involving burglary or robbery. This interaction took place for at least 20 minutes per day over a period of 8 to 10 consecutive days. Afterwards, a second participant used the same objects at 3 different simulation sessions lasting 5, 30, or 120 minutes. Findings: indirect transfer DNA accounted for only a small portion of the mixed DNA profiles observed, with the exception of 1 out of 234 cases. Switzerland again. The objective of this study was to investigate transfer of DNA from individuals with close connections to handlers. Findings: only a small percentage of DNA profiles showed evidence of transfer from unknown source, while the majority of the profiles contained DNA of the person who committed the stabbing. Next, we go to Australia. These authors explore different work areas, laboratory areas, office areas, inaccessible areas, and common areas in order to explore aspects of DNA transfer, including secondary and tertiary transfer. All right. Findings: inaccessible areas were sampled to demonstrate secondary transfer. Moreover, these authors concluded that the detection profiles not always corresponded to the last person touching them. There it is. I'll read that again. In Australia, these authors explored different areas, laboratory areas, office areas, inaccessible areas, and common areas, in order to explore aspects of DNA transfer, including secondary and tertiary transfer. Findings: inaccessible areas were sampled to demonstrate secondary transfer. Moreover, these authors concluded that the detected profiles not always corresponded to the last person touching them. Not always. All right, here we go. Next stop, Norway. Investigation on the secondary transfer using different scenarios in order to investigate possible occurrences of secondary transfer from coworkers. T-shirt used daily with investigation in order to detect an exogenous DNA profile. Findings: These findings confirm the possibility of obtaining secondary transfer. You can from your coworker, huh? Okay. Australia. The researchers utilized saliva from a male donor as a source of DNA that was manually transferred onto object. To achieve this, 4 female participants pressed their dominant hand onto a plate coated with saliva for a period of 10 seconds, and then immediately placed the same hand on a clean glass plate for another 10 seconds. Findings: DNA transfer occurred in a different manner, strictly related to the different parts of the hand. Wow. Okay, those are interesting findings right there. Thank you, Australia. Next, United Kingdom. To mimic regular use, the researchers had each participant handle a knife in a specific way. These participants shook hands with a fellow volunteer for 10 seconds and then stabbed a foam block repeatedly with one of their knives for a minute. Findings: with the exception of one participant, less than 5% of the recovered profiles had a non-donor DNA code deposited. Okay. Next up, Austria. The authors investigated different scenarios: indirect transfer via camera, indirect transfer via car, indirect transfer via desk, about a police officer's DNA transfer on crime scene samples, gathering an indirect transfer as a source of contamination. Findings: the authors confirmed the possibility of DNA transfer from police officers' DNA onto crime scene items through 3 different scenarios. Okay. Next up is Germany. In this scenario, items belonging to one person are taken in a robbery by another person. In the second scenario, items are used by one person before being handled in a less severe manner. Findings: when the second user simulated by a burglary by using a tool barehanded, the first user may not be found as a major component on their handles. When the second user broke up the burglary setup using gloves, the first user matched the DNA profile in 37% of the cases. 37% I think is kind of high. And are they factoring in shedding status and all those other things? Next up, Australia. On glass plates, both the depositor's self-DNA and non-self DNA from the known contributor who shook hands with them were deposited. Findings: the experimental models results indicated that a considerable amount of DNA is transferred. Each is linked to an individual's ability to transfer their own DNA. Shedding status. Do you guys notice a theme here? Transfer is possible in almost every single experiment these countries are experimenting with. Every time. So to rule out that secondary transfer couldn't have happened is just negligent on Riley Nolan's part. Oh, I am me. Welcome. So good to see you. Okay. Next stop, Australia. The objective of this study was to assess the potential risk of contamination resulting from a transfer of dried saliva and skin deposits between glass surfaces using new, unused squirrel hair and fiberglass brushes. Various scenarios were examined during the investigation. These experimental models results indicated that squirrel hair and fiberglass brushes can collect transfer DNA varying amounts of DNA containing material. The detectability of the transferred material on secondary surface depends on the biological nature of the material being transferred. Okay. Australia. Transfer from hand to object and subsequently secondary transfer from object to object. Their findings. Possibility to find the secondary transfer. Okay, that one is pretty straightforward. Next, Australia. The researchers conducted a laundry experiment where 38 individuals were provided with a cotton swatch measuring roughly 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters to be washed and dried with laundry using their own washing machine and detergent. As negative controls, 2 cotton swatches were randomly selected. Findings. The DNA profiles of most cotton swatches samples indicated either a distinct single source, 21%, or a blend of DNA from multiple sources, 55%. In the case of mixed profiles, the majority of them, around 2 or 3 persons, showed DNA from only one source, while a few, around 1 in 5, had a combination of DNA from 4 individuals. So even with washing, it's possible to pull out a single source, but that doesn't mean there weren't other people in there, other people's DNA profiles in there. All right, next up, Australia. After exchanging 2 handshakes, the participants resumed their regular activities for either 40 minutes, 5 hours, or 8 hours. Later, they held a polished wooden axe handled with their right hand and rotated it to produce friction for 10 seconds. Main findings. The profiles obtained from the axe handlers after they were in contact with the known contributor for 40 minutes, 5 hours, or 8 hours showed a diverse range of alleles. In all the profiles from the axe handle, except for one 4-person mixture generated after the depositor's contact 40 minutes post-handshake. The depositor was the primary or sole contributor. Okay. Israel. Under various washing conditions, a group of 8 new socks made of different cotton blends were washed together with the regular laundry of 4 households. Main findings. The possibility of secondary transfer was confirmed by 7 of 32 samples, about 22%. United Kingdom. The researchers designed an experiment where a person used knives for 4 minutes over 2 days before another individual used them for 2, 30, or 60 seconds to determine how shorter durations of second use affect the resulting DNA profiles. Main findings. The DNA ratios of the first user to the second user were around 4:1, 2:1, and 1:1 for durations of 2, 30, and 60 seconds respectively. The analysis of the DNA quantities showed the trend occurred due to a decrease in the DNA of the first user, transferred to the second user's hands, rather than an increase in the DNA disposition from the second user. This trend was observed after the knives were used by the first user for a total of 4 minutes over 2 days, with 4 being used by the second user for the specified duration. Next up, Australia. In this research, the contact types adopted by Garraway et al., namely passive pressure friction and friction with pressure, were employed to explore the transfer between aluminum and substrates. Findings. The first time, researchers were able to visually detect the transfer of DNA from one substrate to another by using fluorescent diamond dye. Ooh, what is that? To visualize the cellular transfer. Okay, that is cool. Next up is Germany. In this study, the goal was to evaluate the extent to which the DNA of an innocent person is transferred to a crime scene through work gloves, taking into account whether the suspect is a shutter or not. Findings. The results of this study show that the glove, especially its exterior, could act as a vector for secondary transfer in real-life scenarios. Exactly. Even if the perpetrator was wearing gloves, they could have other people's DNA on those gloves. And so while the perpetrator is handling objects found at the crime scene, they could have had somebody else's DNA on the glove the whole time. And that would be secondary transfer. So there's no way of knowing if the perpetrator wore gloves and they had other people's DNA on it, or how the DNA transfer DNA got there. There's no way to tell these scenarios because nobody was there. Nobody knows. I mean, none of these experts or court actors, they don't. Not even the expert, the lab analysts. And Riley Nolan does not know if Brian's was DNA on the outside of the gloves of the perpetrator, which is highly likely that there are DNA outside on the gloves. All right, next stop. Where did we go? Oh, here we go. Oh, Spain. Oh, we haven't heard from Spain yet. The researchers instructed 5 individuals to hold hands for 5 minutes and then wash their hands with soap, having a neutral pH level. Next, they dried their hands using different towels each day. To serve as a control group, the researchers analyzed a portion of each towel that was found used, and they also collected saliva samples from all participants to determine their reference profiles. Findings. The researchers were able to obtain a comprehensive profile, either the towel or the individual who had made contact with the object, as well as the partner. Wait, so is it indistinguishable? Can they tell what is what? I'm kind of liking how they give us a quick rundown of the experiment, and then they give us a quick rundown of the findings. This is fun. All right, we're moving on to Australia. This study examined various situations involving 4 participants known as wearers. 2 upper garments that belonged to the primary participant and had been worn before were chosen. Each of the selected garments was worn on both a workday and a non-work day. Findings. The research suggests that in certain situations, the presence of close associates may overshadow the wearer's contributions. Depending on the situation and the area of the garment, as a result, the wearer contributions may be minor or even absent. Isn't that interesting? Whoever participated in this, they had more coworker DNA on their sweater than their own in some areas. That's amazing. All right, next. Germany. 4 firearm handling scenarios simulated different actions of the shooter. Main findings. The amount of DNA subsequent to indirect transfer is strictly related to handling conditions of surface types. Probably different types of metals and polymers and all that. Okay. Next, Switzerland. For all experiments, a pair of identical knives were utilized, with one assigned to each participant. The participants, categorized as either a good or bad shutter, were instructed to shake hands before using their respective knives to stab a ballistic soap. Findings. The secondary transfers related to the shutter status, target surfaces, and alleged transfer mechanisms, compared to the primary transfer. It occurs with a percentage between 1 and 3%. All right. Next, Australia. This study recruited 4 participants, also referred to as wearers, from 4 different laboratories. The participants wore the selected garments for an average of 5.1 hours before hugging another individual, an average of 5.2 hours, minimum 3.5 hours, and maximum 6.5 hours before going out with another individual, and an average of 1.5 hours before spending a day with another individual in another individual's office. Well, let's get interesting. There's so many interactions already. The time spent wearing the garments includes both at home during commuting and at work before engaging in the respective activity. Now, I would say this experiment simulates real life the most, because we have wearers, they hugged another person, they went out with somebody, and then somebody at work. You know, these complex interactions that we all have with people that we know and don't know, and we walk by and we don't walk by. All right, let's see what it has to say for this realistic scenario here. Findings. According to this study, the DNA of a person of interest was successfully recovered from a piece of clothing after direct contact, close proximity, and physical absence. The experiment involved embracing an individual or occupying their office space, after which several DNA profiles were identified from the clothing. The transfer of DNA was more likely to occur following prolonged and or recurring contact as well as direct contact. All right. But we don't know at what percentages. And it's not going to happen the same for each experiment. But that was a very interesting one. Very interesting. I wish we had more information on that one. Oh, look. That was from 2022. I'll open that in a new tab. We can read that one later. All right. Next stop, Germany. This study involves the use of gloves. Uh-oh. I'm frozen. Hold on. Oh my God, there's an ad. I don't know if you can still see my screen, but there's an ad on the right of my screen. It says, skip the cloning. Upgraded gene synthesis. Transfection-ready clonal genes, 100% NGS verified. Yeah, if you haven't watched the live called Designer DNA, I go into depth about DNA cloning and creating synthetic DNA. That's so funny that I got an ad for it on the side. It's like, skip the cloning. You can order clone DNA through the mail now, but apparently they got to make sure you're a real scientist first. I know, I'm still frozen. Let's see here. Oh, here we go. Okay, cool. So, I'm frozen. The computer is not liking stuff. Let me see if I can click on StreamYard. Oh my gosh. No. All right, there's StreamYard. It's gonna let me do it? No. I'm stuck over here, guys. I can't see chat. Oh, here I am. I'm back. All right, cool. I can see you guys. All right. Maybe I should close some of these windows on my home. Oh, watch me X out of the thing we're reading. Oh, Tanel's gonna watch dogs while she's listening. That's so cute. All right. All right, next up, we go to Italy. The authors performed a secondary transfer scenario simulating that the owner of the credit card, after his personal use for a month, places and moves it around the surface of a coworker's desk, applying slight pressure for 30 seconds. Main findings. The author reported a high value of secondary transfer. About 50% of the secondary transfer DNA traces. Whoa! That's a lot. I would expect it to be below 20%, below 10%, but 50% of the time. All right. And it was demonstrated that the coworker could be identified as the major contributor. There it is. Italy figured it out. Italy did this in 2023. So let me read this one again because this one is relevant to the Brian Koberger case. From Italy, 2023, the experiment. The authors performed a secondary transfer scenario simulating that the owner of a credit card, after his personal use for a month, places and moves it around the surface of a coworker's desk, applying slight pressure for 30 seconds. Main findings. The authors reported a high value of secondary transfer, about 50% of secondary transfer DNA traces. And it was demonstrated that the coworker could be identified as the major contributor. And that could have been what happened in this case, and Randy Nolan cannot testify to that. All right, moving on. Australia. The authors explored the possibility of an indirect transfer mediated by a domestic dog. Ooh. All right, main findings. Based on their findings, the authors concluded that dogs could be a vector for a human DNA transfer, demonstrating a transfer from the dog to a gloved hand during petting and the bed sheet while walking. Oh. That is interesting. Okay. That was cool. I think those were all of them. All right. We're moving on. It says 3.1 technical results. Analyzing the main technical data, sampling, method, DNA extraction, quantification, amplification. It is important to remark that all selected articles were performed over a wide period from 1999 to 2023, more than 20 years. In this period, forensic genetics constantly improved their methods, offering more sensitive and specific techniques that revolutionize this forensic field. In general, the summarized results refer to DNA extraction, quantification, and amplification, and are strictly related to the period when the study was performed. A study performed in 1999 did not have the possibility to use the same techniques as a study performed in 2023. The sampling method, the DNA extraction protocol, and the quantification and amplification techniques are summarized in Table 2. All right. All right. Let's go down. That was really cool. They gave us all that info. All right. Analyzing sample techniques. The most used technique to collect biological samples was the double swab. It was used in 25 cases, while the single swab was used in 10 experimental methods. Adhesive tape was used in 13 cases, while cutting out was used in 4 cases. Finally, 3 papers did not report the sampling method. The use of the double swab technique was justified by the experimental model. The main goal of each study was to focus on the secondary transfer generated after a touch. As reported in the literature and confirmed in this review, to sample skin cells, the single double swab techniques or adhesive tape was the best methods to guarantee adequate cell recovery. Moreover, the cutting out technique could be applied in selected experimental models, for example, garment sampling, considering that it may not always be used on hard surfaces. Regarding the sample methods, a recent literature review concluded that a single swab method showed the highest efficiency in touch DNA recovery in a wide variety of experimental settings. Regarding DNA extraction, the DNAiQ system was the most used method, applied in 19 experimental models, followed by 5% in Chilix, used in 8 studies, while in-house protocols were applied in 7 experimental models. The QIA shutter and the QIA AMP DNA extraction procedure was applied in 5 experimental models. QIAGEN, we were recently talking about QIAGEN, I think. QI AMP DNA mini kit, QIAGEN QI AMP investigator kit was used 3 times. Maxwell 16 blood DNA purification kit was used 3 times. QIAGEN DNA all tissue DNA kit was used once. First DNA kit twice. Prep Finder automated forensic DNA extraction kit used once, and Speed Tools DNA was used once. Okay, so they were used in other experimental articles. In 3 cases, the authors did not indicate the extraction protocol, while in 6 cases, an in-house method was used. In recent research article, it has been demonstrated that swabs and direct PCR could positively influence the DNA profiling from a touch surface, reducing the number of cells required. So a lot of that large report that both Becca Barlow, Riley Nolan referenced, that NIST one that talks about the system approach. All of these things are in there. As you can see, a lot of these experiments, they use different extraction methods. Now, with the systems approach, they try to study what's being done. So just like this article said, that, as the years went by, their experiments got a little bit more sophisticated, and then they were able to focus on target different types of information and to be able to have a wide range of things. But they all had different methods on how they do that. To keep track of those methods so that the scientific community can have any type of regulation or any type of standards, they need that information, and that's exactly why they do it. That's exactly why that report was made, is to improve DNA interpretation and to improve these types of studies, because there are so many different types of things, and they need to keep track of how they're different from another thing, and that report was there to document all of that. And it sounds like most of the report, they're veering away from lab analysts stating in court the mechanism of transfer, whether it was indirect or direct, and they're veering away from the lab analysts to determine the how and the when transfer or trace DNA got there. Even if she's calling it touch DNA because she thinks it's a little, the amount is over the amount that could be considered trace, it's still transfer. It still applies to all this stuff. I think I don't know if she was saying that to cover her butt, but it's certainly it's a little bit, I think, unrelated to the fact that it's still transfer. Transfer because of the amount. It could have been from a secondary user, a secondary, tertiary. It's really hard to decide, and the fact that we don't even know what the weapon was that was used. That sheath could have been owned by one of the victims. As we saw, there were lots of knives in the social media posts of these students. So to say, okay, that's the perpetrators, I think it's so elementary. It doesn't make sense to me why I would say, okay, this is definitely the perpetrators. It seems a little immature to go that route. I don't know, though. I would have gone with the blood samples. Oh, there's some graphs, sampling methods. Oh, here we go. Single swabs are in blue. Cutting out is in this dark orange. A double swab is gray. Okay, so they use double swab of almost 50% of all the stuff. Adhesive tape is this yellow. And the non-reported is this like turquoise little sliver. Okay, look. DNA extraction methods. Look how colorful this one is. There's really very little standardization here. All right. In-house protocols where they didn't specify is in blue. DNA IQ system is yellow. I can't see all these colors. This looks like the darkest blue. This is the QI shutter / QI AMP DNA method, 9%. QIGen AMP DNA mini kit, I think is this orange, the darker orange right here for 7%. QIGen, we did that one. Other methods, one time for each. Other methods looks like it's not. That was 9%. I don't know what they mean by other. Okay, 5% with the Chilix method, which is gray. I think it's this gray. Number 14. No. Oh, no, it's this dark gray. It's 5%. Not reported is us. Oh, I don't see that on there. And then the Maxwell method, 16 blood DNA purification kit. I don't know if that's on there either. Okay, cool. Analyzing the quantification tool in 2 articles, 3 quantification techniques were used in each. While quantification technique was not used in 2 research articles, moreover, this information was not included in 6 experimental models. The kits are listed below, which we just went through a bunch of the kits. Okay. As previously described, modern techniques could improve profiling by applying direct PCR after swab sampling. On the other hand, the use of quantification methods may evaluate quantification between male and female DNA, are very useful in evaluation of activity level. Okay. That's very interesting. I like this article a lot. So, I'll come back and say hello to everybody. So I will be on CJ's, I think at 9. I've got about 15 minutes to get ready to hop over there. I did put his link in the description. So if anybody wants to follow me over there, we will be talking about, I think it's the 911 call and all those texts, which I do believe somebody said that they're missing from the website now. So that'll be interesting to find that out and to talk further about it. So thank you all for coming. Oh, I see you twizzle your hearts with your sparkly orange thumb profile pic. Awesome. All right, everybody. I will see you next time. Take care. Follow me over to CJ's. Bye.